Good evening. It's almost 7:40. Sorry for the late beginning, but thank you for coming out and joining us on this beautiful evening. My name is Arul Kumaran, and I'm the Dean of this team here. And it is my privilege to welcome you all to this signature event of our college, the Keenan lecture in its 29th edition this year. This lecture commemorates and celebrates the life of Mike Keenan, who was born in 1937 and died in 1986, the first dean of STM from 1975 to 1985. Mike Keenan first came to STM on the invitation of Father Peter Swan in 1965, but after 2 years he and his young family went back to Ontario so that he could pursue his doctoral studies in psychology at the University of Waterloo. So he was still a young man. When he finished, he came back to STM in 1971 as the head of the Department of Psychology. And within 4 years, he was appointed the Dean, in which position he served until he was taken away from us in 1986. His young wife, Pat, who's sitting there at the time, whom we are fortunate enough to have with us here today, along with her 3 children, one of whom, Terry, is right there. Thank you, Terry. He is here today with us, along with his mother, have remained in the city since then, and have become part of the city's life, and that of the college. Through her generosity, Pat and the Keenan family have established this annual lecture to remember Mike Keenan by, and we have been privileged to listen to leading intellectuals and other leaders from various fields on this podium year after year for the last 29 years. Through all these years, I must say, this lecture has become a celebration not only of Mike Keenan's service and commitment to college, but also Pat's and Mike's twin brother, Robert, their continuing commitment to what our college stands for, an intellectual synthesis of faith and reason, a commitment to scholarship. It has been the mission of this lecture to invite scholars who explore this relation. In that sense, Pat and her family have remained an integral part of the STM family and its mission. For that, we are very grateful. So Pat, if you would come here, it's just a token of appreciation for us. Kagan, our student leader, will present her with some flowers. So we have a committee to decide, whom to invite every year. So last spring, when we met, we decided that because of a certain president of the United States, the media has come into focus. So we thought we should have somebody to come and talk to us about media, but not in a superficial sense, but in a scholarly and in a kind of more. It is easy to get people to say inflammatory things now, right? So, but this is a college, like I said. We explore relations, in an intellectual level. So, so we were looking at it. We didn't have to look far. The name Eric McLuhan suggested itself, and as soon as the name was suggested, the committee immediately agreed that we should pursue him. And thankfully, Eric McLuhan said yes. So, after all those months, we have Dr. Eric McLuhan here, and to introduce him, may I invite one of my colleagues on that committee, Sarah Powrie, a professor of English here at STM. Sarah.
It is my honor to introduce to you this evening Dr. Eric McLuhan, our distinguished speaker for the 29th Keenan Memorial Lecture. An internationally known and award-winning lecturer, Dr. McLuhan is a communications theorist and a media ecologist. Initially a collaborator with his late father, Marshall McLuhan, Eric McLuhan is now the guardian and curator of his father's intellectual legacy. He has authored and co-authored several books on media and communications, including The Laws of Media, Electric Language, Cynic Satire, the Human Equation series, and most recently, the Sensus Communis, Synesthesia and the Soul. Dr. McLuhan has over 40 years of teaching experience in areas such as reading techniques, literature, media, and communications theory. He is a co-founder of McLuhan and Davies Communication, which assists business professionals with their writing. In 2007, he received the Neil Postman Award for Career Achievement in Public Intellectual Activity. In 2011, the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto awarded him an honorary degree of sacred letters. We live in a world of proliferating social media platforms, of cyberbullying, cyberstalking, and cybersecurity, of WikiLeaks, Russian hackers, presidential tweets, and fake news on Facebook. Marshall McLuhan famously said that the medium is the message, and in the digital age, we can now appreciate more than ever the prescient wisdom of his insight. The new media has proven to be a mixed blessing, both creating opportunities for international collaboration and improving accessibility, while at the same time enabling the manufacture of misinformation and propaganda. Dr. McLuhan's work on media and communications is timely and important, and it promises to assist us in making sense of the ways in which the new media shapes our society, our relationships with one another, and even our own sense of self-identity. Please join me tonight in extending a very warm welcome to this year's Keenan lecturer, Dr. Eric McLuhan.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'd also like to take this moment to thank St. Thomas More College for inviting me to join the distinguished company who have already contributed to the Keenan Lecture Series, and to thank in particular Pat Keenan and her progeny. I'm going to be talking tonight about the senses and how they work in the whole business of media. There are three groups of senses, and I'll be talking about each of them. Each of them is a family. Beginning in the 19th century, we introduced radically new forms of communication. Electric technologies, such as the telegraph and the telephone, and soon after them, radio. Unlike earlier hardware technologies, these new forms operate at speeds approaching the speed of light, virtually instantaneously. Older forms of communication, such as speech and writing, move goods and information at speeds commensurate with human scale. At electric speeds, on the other hand, there is no movement to or fro, from place to place or person to person. There's no human scale at all. If you will, the message doesn't move from here to there. It is the sender that is sent, minus his physical body, in effect. The audience, the receiver, performs a complementary action and is suddenly everywhere at the same time. Both parties are simply, suddenly, and unexpectedly present everywhere. The physical body no longer constitutes a limiting factor. On the telephone or on the air or online, the disembodied user is simultaneously here and there at the same time. The user can be in two places at once, or 2 dozen, or 2 million. there is, frankly, no difference. For some generations now, we've been calling this condition the mass audience. For the mass audience, there's no transport to or from, just simultaneity of being. And from that you can deduce that these new media belong not to physics, and they don't obey physical laws, they belong really to metaphysics. This is what distinguishes my father's work from that of everyone else who looks at or comments on media. A while ago, a chap called Kenneth Johnson wrote an article about Marshall McLuhan and called it the metaphysician of media, and he was absolutely right. A lot of people who grapple with my father's work try to imagine him as something else, as a theoretician, and he wasn't. He was doing a very new thing. This is a new experience of being, this separation of body from and its constraints. The new media, then, are not manifestations of physical communication so much as manifestations of metaphysical communication. They entail the transformation of the users, of you and me. 21st century man, electronic man, has now lived, minus a physical body, for a century and a half. He has become disembodied, discarnate, and has become accustomed to substituting an abstract image for his physical being. Next to social media, the telephone is the most obvious prototype of these disembodying instruments, and it underpins all the effects that go with this new state of affairs. Discarnate man has, for example, no relation to nature or to natural law, and thus has no private identity and no relation to natural mortality or morality. St. Thomas frequently, repeatedly urges that the principle of individuation is the joining or the intersection of a body and a soul. The soul is the animating principle of the body, and it makes it a human body. Clearly then, the soul is the formal cause of the body. The common sense, the old term is the sensus communis, has at least three separate spheres of operation. One is the five bodily senses, and this is the one usually referred to in ancient and medieval commentaries: sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. Marshall McLuhan called this little group of senses the sensorium in his writing, and he made perception and the sensorium the basis of his study of media and of literature. In 1964, in Understanding Media, he put it this way. He said, "It may very well be that in our conscious inner lives, the interplay among our senses is what constitutes the sense of touch. Perhaps touch is not just skin contact with things, but the very life of things in the mind. It begins to be evident that touch is not skin, but the interplay of the senses, and keeping in touch, or getting in touch, is a matter of a fruitful meeting of the senses, of sight translated into sound, and sound into movement, and taste and smell. The common sense was for many centuries held to be the peculiar human power of translating of one kind of experience, of one sense, into all the senses, and presenting the result continuously as a unified image to the mind. In fact, this image of a unified ratio among the senses was long held to be the mark of our rationality, and may in the computer age easily become that again." Now, he wrote that in '64, and we see it happening around us. He went on, "Fragmentation by means of visual stress occurs in that isolation of moment in time or aspect in space that is beyond the power of touch or hearing or smell or movement. by imposing unvisualizable relationships that are a result of instant speed, electric technology dethrones the visual sense and restores us to the dominion of synesthesia and the close inter-involvement of all the other senses. Oops. In addition to the corporal, the bodily sensus communis, that is, this interplay of senses, there are two others. One constituted of the four intellectual senses of scripture and poetry, and another involving the three theological virtues or senses of faith, hope, and love. And they are senses by which you know things. Faith, hope, and love. Now consider what happens when the two, the body and soul, are sundered by technology, however briefly. In terms of the corporal, the bodily sensus communis, the effect is to remove the ground that supports private individual identity. The recourse then is to seek identity in a group. And there have sprung up a multitude of group participatory experiences available on the internet, not the least of which are social media and the many role-playing games. The aspiration of our time for wholeness, empathy, and depth of awareness is a natural adjunct to electric technology. The age of mechanical industry that preceded us found vehement assertion of private outlook the natural mode of expression. Every culture and every age has its favorite model of perception and knowledge that it is inclined to prescribe for everybody and everything. Our time is characterized by its revulsion against imposed patterns. We are suddenly eager to have things and people declare their beings totally. There is a deep faith to be found in this new attitude, a faith that corresponds to the ultimate harmony of all being. Many people today insist that they experience a strong sense of individualism in this electronic world, even against a ground of intense participation in the various online games and of constant use of social media. Individualism, of course, requires detachment from the group. And all pressure is on us, and the urge is in all of us to participate in each other and in every form that we can. It cannot be the same individualism that print and the alphabet brought, because the ground there was composed of rational detachment and objectivity. Instead, this new kind of individualism bears a remarkable resemblance to the situation of the angels, created spirits without bodies. Traditional theology points out that their individuality comes from the fact that every angel is a separate species. The same then would seem to be the condition of man in the discarnate condition. Each and every one of us is now a separate species, the condition we now call individualism. The moral anarchy that surrounds us is directly related to our technologies as formal influences, and does not result from the uses to which the technologies are put. Facts which are totally overlooked by the commentators on the impact of the telephone and other media. The content of the telephone or radio or TV or computer or satellite and so on serves precisely the same function as the meaning of the poem. It keeps the mind occupied while the technology does its work when nobody's watching. Technological modifications of the body or the sensory order have corresponding effects on the sensus communis. Among them is a distinct weakening of the sense of faith. Now, I've always understood faith to be a way of knowing. I was taught this in my catechism days. That is, faith is another sense. not one of touch and hearing, but nevertheless a sense by which you simply know things. Analogous to how you know, for example, that something is coarse, or smooth, or loud, or bright, or sweet. Faith, then, is not opinion, and it's not belief in the ordinary sense. Though we often use these two terms casually to refer to faith, belief and opinion, on the other hand, are things that we decide to have. Faith is not a decision, it's knowing. The kind of perception and knowledge given to or through the soul. It uses the soul as a sense modality, or you could say it uses the soul as a medium of communication. As Pope John Paul II wrote, "Only faith enables us to experience the salvific presence of God in Christ in the very center of life and of history. Faith alone reveals to us the meaning of the human condition and our supreme dignity as sons and daughters of God who are called to communion with Him." Faith is supernatural knowing, experiential knowing of supernatural matters. St. Paul wrote, "Faith is the substance of things hoped for," you all know this quote, "the evidence of things unknown," in Hebrews. A substance, now he said it's the substance of things hoped for. A substance does not consist of opinion or belief. You can experience a substance. Equally with evidences, the evidence of things unseen. You may have opinions about evidence, and you may express belief or incredulity about or doubt about them, but neither belief nor opinion is faith. So faith is unmediated, direct experience, direct knowledge of things spiritual. Anagogical knowledge. Anagogy is the medieval term for this. Equally, hope and love, the greatest of the three, are senses, modes of experience, and perception, and extra bodily knowledge. Just as the three theological virtues are actually senses, or modes of perception and experience, so are the intellectual senses of Scripture. Henri de Lubac, Cardinal later in life, gave a detailed account of this in his 4-volume study, Medieval Exegesis. He called it the senses of Scripture, les quatre sens de l'écriture. There are 4 levels of interpretation, or 4 senses of Scripture. The first 2 senses, the literal sense and the allegorical sense, are outward senses. They're out there. The other 2 senses, the moral sense and the spiritual or anagogical sense, are interior senses. Everything, de Lubac points out, is consummated in the inner man. He insists over and over and over that the interiorized experience of Scripture is not illusion, but real experience, experience to one side of the bodily senses, that is unmediated by the body, and thus it is direct experience, which is also mystical experience, direct contact. Every group of senses, whether physical, bodily, intellectual, or spiritual, has its own interior harmony and acts as a community, a sensus communis. That's the meaning of the term sensus communis. My father called it the sensorium in his studies of literature and of media. The exterior historical sense contains the other senses inasmuch as without the literal, the letters on the page, without those you've nothing, a blank sheet of paper. The anagogic and moral senses contain the others in an organic unity of interiorized experience. That unity is the sensus communis of the intellectual human soul. And that interiorized experience is characterized by incompleteness. it demands human participation to complete it. De Lubac observed, he said, Mysterium Christi, only this unique mystery possesses infinite depths, and the mind of each of the faithful has varying capacities for comprehending it. From this there results for every spiritual understanding, as we've seen more especially for the spiritual level, an incurable character of incompleteness, but, as the Gregorian term volatus for anagogy has already indicated, this fateful incompleteness is to be considered above all in its positive and dynamic aspect. The Word of God does not cease to create and to hollow out within the one who readies himself for it the capacity to receive it, with the result that the faithful understanding can increase indefinitely. By allegory, the old text can always let more novelty shine through. The new mystery can always be more interiorized and introduce eternity more deeply into the heart. That mystical interiorization and completion comes about through the sensus communis of the body and has been practiced for thousands of years by the poets. The sensus communis that Aquinas discusses is itself an interior sense, the interior aspect of the sense of touch. Aquinas only knew of 5 bodily senses. Nowadays we recognize upwards of 25 bodily senses. And we may get to that later. That is, the common sense is, as it were, the etymology of each and every one of the exterior bodily senses, just as the spiritual sense is, as it were, the etymology of each and every one of the other scriptural senses. St. Thomas makes exactly that observation. He writes, the interior sense is called common, not by predication, as if it were a genus, but as the common root and principle of the exterior senses. In this he concurs with Aristotle, who held that the particular senses are all developments of touch, depending on the intervention of a more refined medium. Besides the specific senses, there is the sensus communis, which is not a sixth sense, but a generic power of sensation as such, which provides unity for the sensitive soul in its particular manifestations. It's Aristotle. That is, the common sense is the locus where the physical senses meet. It is, as it were, the faculties club, where the several faculties get together and tell stories and swap gossip about each other and what they're doing and what they're up to. A modern name for this both sessions is synesthesia. Synesthesia is the operating sense, or the operating system, if you will, of the sensus communis. Take away a sense, and the others come together to fill in the gap, in their own terms. Add a new sense, and the others adjust to the new mix. Intensify the operation of a sense, and the others respond to the new stress, all and each in its own way. And that is precisely my father's theory of media, as extensions of man. Of the 4 intellectual senses of traditional interpretation, 2 are outward and 2 interior, as I said. History and allegory are out there, outwardly manifested and available to the outward senses. So after 2 levels of outward attention comes the big turn, the big trope, the process of interiorization in the senses of tropology and anagogy, also called the moral sense and the spiritual sense. Now, de Lubac says, and this is the key to the whole business, and what got me started on this journey, it is no longer we who are acting when you're in touch with these spiritual interiorized senses. It is these words, once having been introduced, which act within us, releasing the spirit of which they have been made, the meaning and sonority included within them, and which veritably become spirit and life and action-producing words. They belong to a place beyond our mental control. There is a certain irresistible force of authority and order in them, but they have ceased to be exterior. They have become ourselves. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. One must understand the whole captivating, appropriating power of these two words, in nobis, among us. The experience that de Lubac here describes is of exactly the same pattern as the mimesis used by Homer and the oral poetic establishment before the introduction of the alphabet. Mimesis is the technique of interiorization, knowing by putting on, knowing by becoming intellectually and emotionally the thing known. This is integral, interiorized knowing instead of conceptual knowing, unmediated, direct perception by the body and the emotions and the intellect of the hearer. In other words, by the hearer's soul. Direct experience by total submergence. Think of video games. Direct experience by total submergence. De Lubac frequently links interiorization to the moral and anagogic senses. The trope in tropology is also a turning away from symbolic theology to mystical theology. Now Plato decided to champion the rationality that appeared in Greece alongside the phonetic alphabet. He declared war on the poets in the Republic and their use of mimesis to communicate the oral encyclopedia. Mimesis, this total subsuming of the hearer, was the exact opposite of rational objectivity and detachment, traits that characterize the phonetic alphabet. The classicist Eric Havelock pays careful attention to the matter in his study called Preface to Plato, meaning what went on just before Plato. Here's what Havelock says. Plato in the Republic is describing a total technology of the preserved word, a state of total personal involvement and therefore of emotional identification with the substance of the poetized statement. Remember what de Lubac was saying a moment ago. To identify with the performance as an actor does with his lines was the only way it could be done. You threw yourself, as a listener, you threw yourself into the situation of Achilles. You identified with his grief or his anger. You yourself became Achilles, and so did the reciter to whom you listened. 30 years later, you could automatically quote what Achilles had said or what the poet had said about him. Such enormous powers of recitation, of total loss of poetic memorization, could be purchased only at the cost of total loss of objectivity. This, then, is the master clue to Plato's choice of the word mimesis to describe the poetic experience. It focuses initially not on the artist's creative act, but on his power to make his audience identify almost pathologically, and certainly sympathetically, with the content of what he is saying. Havelock points out that Plato was correctly concerned with the emotional pathology of the performance, and it explains also why he chose the term mimesis to describe several aspects of the poetic experience, which today we feel should be separated. The translation of mimesis, imitation, it can now be seen does not adequately translate the word. What we're talking about, this total subsuming and involvement with the poetic statement, is not just imitation. Imitation presumes an original that you imitate or reproduce somewhere else. The whole essence of Plato's point, the point of his attack, is that in poetic performance as practiced until then in Greece, there was no original. The original was your experience on the spot. The minstrel recited the tradition and the audience listened, repeated, and recalled, and so absorbed it. But the minstrel recited effectively only as he reenacted the doings and sayings of heroes and made them his own, a process which can be described in reverse as making himself resemble them. He sank his personality into his performance. His audience, in turn, would remember only as they entered effectively and sympathetically into what he was saying, and this, in turn, meant that they became his servants and submitted to his spell. Think of youngsters listening to the new music and performing. As they did this, they engaged also in a reenactment of the tradition with lips, larynx, and limbs, and with the whole apparatus of their unconscious nervous system. The pattern of behavior of artist and audience was therefore in some important respects identical. It can be described mechanically as a continual repeating of rhythmic doings. Psychologically, it's an act of personal commitment, of total engagement, and of emotional identification. There's no room here for detachment. The pattern of behavior brought into play by the poets is the same experience that de Lubac described as tropological knowing. Tropology entails using all of the senses of both modes of sensus communis, the bodily and the intellectual, simultaneously. Havelock's observation echoes strongly with two familiar statements by St. Paul. Faith comes by hearing. Remember that one? He wrote this to the Romans. That is, it would appear now, faith comes by mimesis, by participatory experience. Not as concepts, it's not ideas, it's not belief. This saying has long seemed mysterious and enigmatic to us, but considered in the context of a society of non-literates still susceptible to mimesis, it would be an accurate technical observation about the operation of media. Faith comes by hearing. The second statement is another familiar and puzzling declaration. He said, "The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life." This too could be read as a technical observation about the effect of alphabetic writing. It kills mimesis, as Plato knew and Aristotle too. Both men were at pains to circumvent mimesis and the spellbinding power of the poetic establishment that relied upon it, in order that they might take advantage of detachment and abstract thought, and thereby philosophize. Now, about 1 person in 700 among us lives an extraordinarily rich sensory life. Such people live, that is, in full conscious awareness of their sensus communis. They live every moment of their lives submerged in the interactions of each of the senses with some or all of the others. They are called synesthetes. I wonder if there are any present in our audience tonight. Don't put up your hand, I'm just wondering. But it's likely there are enough here. Synesthetes simply experience the sensus communis in the foreground of their awareness, while the rest of us have it operating behind the scenes, outside of conscious awareness. The mystical experience of anagogy, of the spiritual sense, also relies on the sensus communis, both of body and of intellect. There's no place in anagogy for detachment or objectivity. That would kill it. So certain groups of people make it their business, their occupation, to get in touch with these interior senses. I'm speaking of the contemplative orders. Concerning objectivity, there is the testimony of Jacques Luciran, a blind man. who, when he was 7 years old, was suddenly blinded in a schoolyard accident. He recovered vision almost immediately. Now, his eyes did not work at all. Totally gone. Here's what he said. I did not become a musician, and the reason was a strange one. I had no sooner made a sound on the A string, on D or G or C, than I no longer heard it. I looked at it. Tones, chords, melodies, rhythms, each was immediately transformed into pictures, curves, lines, shapes, landscapes, and most of all, colors. Whenever I made the A string sound by itself with the bow, such a burst of light appeared before my eyes and lasted so long that I had to stop playing. As concerts, for me, the orchestra was like a painter. It flooded me with all the colors of the rainbow. If the violin came in by itself, I was suddenly filled with gold and fire. If the violin came in by itself, yes, and with red so bright I could not remember having seen it on any object. When it was the oboe's turn, a clear green ran all through me, so cool that I seemed to feel the breath of night. I visited the land of music. I rested my eyes on every one of its scenes. I loved it till I caught my breath, but I saw music too much to be able to speak its language. My own language was the language of shapes. Strange chemistry. This chemistry which changed a symphony into a moral purpose, an adagio into a poem, a concerto into a walk, attaching words to pictures, and pictures to words, daubing the world with colors, and finally making the human voice the most beautiful of all instruments. He continues, for my part, I had an idea of people, an image, not the one seen by the world at large. Frankly, said hair, eyes, mouth, the necktie, the rings on fingers mattered very little to me. I no longer even thought about these things. People no longer seemed to possess them. Sometimes in my mind, men and women appeared without heads or fingers. Then again, the lady in the chair rose before me in her bracelet, turned into the bracelet itself. There were people whose teeth seemed to fill their whole faces, and others so harmonious they seemed to be made of music. But in reality, none of these sights is made to be described. They are so mobile, so much alive, that they defy words. More pertinent to our investigation, perhaps, is what he observed about the effect of tinkering with the senses. For half a century now, it's been a commonplace of media studies that each technology extends one or another sense or faculty, according to a kind of hyperesthesia, which has the effect of numbing the bodily sense extended and rearranging the interplay between the other senses using the sensus communis. From my own experience, Lucy Wren wrote, I knew very well that it was enough to take from a man a memory here, an association there, to deprive him of hearing or sight, for the world to undergo immediate transformation, and for another world entirely different but entirely coherent to be born. Another world? Not really. The same world, rather, but seen from another angle, counted in entirely new measures. The sensus communis that Lucy Wren describes is that of the physical body. It's not hallucination. It's normal experience, extraordinary only in being conscious. His account has obvious similarities to reports of the mystical experience of the spiritual sense of Scripture. But they're not at all the same thing. The anagogical experience is a compound of two modes of sense, inner and outer, sacred and bodily, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. We usually acknowledge not one kind of sensus communis, but two. One sensus communis relating to the physical body, and one relating to the intellect. Accordingly, there must be two ecologies, one of the body and the corporal senses, and one of the soul and the intellectual senses. These realizations lead to the observation that we use two modes of communication, according to the two modes of sensibility, one for and by the body, and one by and for the intellect, one outward, one inward. Moreover, each of these domains of communication has its own prototypical media of communication. For the outward, we have our technologies, beginning with speech. For the inward, prayer and the Sacraments. But that's not all. There is an additional dimension to man's sensus communis, consisting of the group faith, hope, and charity, love. Each of the theological virtues acts as a sense, a way of knowing, in the form of experience. And as they are an acknowledged group, they must have a common sense of their own. As St. John Paul II commented in Crossing the Threshold of Hope, Christian mysticism from every period, beginning with the era of the fathers of the Eastern and Western Church, to the great theologians of scholasticism, such as St. Thomas Aquinas, to the Northern European mystics, to the Carmelite mystics, is not born of a purely negative enlightenment. It is not born of an awareness of the evil which exists in man's attachment to the world through the senses, the intellect, and the spirit. Instead, Christian mysticism is born of the revelation of the living God. This God opens himself in union with man, arousing in him the capacity to be united with him, especially by means of the theological virtues, faith, hope, and above all, love. These theological senses, tightly interlinked, make up an ecological group of their own, as completely a sensus communis as the two groups we've been discussing so far. Charity, or love, is the foundation of the rest, the one that includes the other theological senses. St. Paul speaks of them as a unit, as these three. And he adds, but the greatest of them is love. It remains only to add that they are not passive senses, but active powers of the soul. Now, I've suggested that our three modes of sensus communis are in active interplay. That being the case, and since it is the soul that animates the body and that makes it human, that is a commonplace in theological study. I suggest further that the theological sensus communis is the formal cause of the other two modes of common sense. Pope St. John Paul II gave us the magisterial male and female, he created them, a theology of the body, which I recommend as strongly as possible. Since all of our media and technologies, without exception, extend our limbs and organs and faculties, the theology of the body can be viewed as a foundation text in a theological understanding of media, technology, and culture. Two things come to mind at this point. For one, the theology of the body has appeared against a ground of discarnate being. The correlative study of theology of the discarnate is urgently needed. Here's something you can do. I mean you. A second consideration, there is only one theory of communication abroad in the entire field of communication study worldwide. One. It's a transportation theory of moving a message or a box of goodies from here through a channel to a receiver. It's called the SMC model, the Source Message Channel Receiver model of communication, invented by a couple of engineers, back in the middle of the last century, Shannon and Weaver. But the essence of all electric media is not transportation, but transformation and simultaneity, not linear, sequential movement. Catholic theology is permeated by the awareness of mimesis and of transformations of being. So it could provide a basis for a theory of communication suited to understanding contemporary media on their own terms. There are challenges here, and clearly an enormous amount of work needs to be done. The effect of all of our electric technologies taken together is to restructure the human sensorium, the physical sensus communis together with the intellectual sensus communis, into a configuration roughly equivalent to their pattern before the introduction, before the incarnation. That is, the effects of the phonetic alphabet are now reversed. The 2,500-year period of the alphabet and its influence has become a sort of digression, or an incubation period, but you have to ask, well, for what? Why? Why is this massive change taking place now? The phonetic alphabet appeared in a particular part of the world and has spread from there. It took 8 centuries to conquer Greece and Rome, and reigned for another 20 centuries before its displacement in our time. The onset of the alphabet's effect was gradual. The overthrow has been sudden by comparison, a mere century and a half. The phonetic alphabet conquered one culture at a time. Electric technologies now constitute global environments, not merely local ones. Every innovation now affects the entire globe simultaneously. The physical body of the disincarnated user, the body's still there, tucked away somewhere in one of the locations, but it's irrelevant to the new condition of being in more than one place at once. The point is that man is now split. He lives 2 lives, one in the body and one out of the body. The natural integrity of the body has been set aside, and the bodily sensus communis is in disarray, disintegrated. Or is it more accurate to say that the dissociated sensibility given us by the alphabet has been forced back together by our electric technologies? Well, my intention this evening was to help clarify the dimensions of the challenges that we really face. Given the nature of those challenges, given particularly the disorientation stirred up by the relatively new state of bodilessness, an understanding of the several modes of sensus communis bids fair to provide an avenue for resolving at least some of the questions we face personally and culturally. For example, it's a commonplace that the newer liturgical forms inhibit private prayer and private meditation during Mass. The causes of these dislocations are not ideology, but perceptual. It's also to be borne in mind that Catholicism is a mimetic religion, both in its liturgy and its sacramental system. Mimesis constitutes the significant difference between the Catholic religion and all others, including, of course, all forms of Protestantism. Clearly, too, the present circumstances demand renewed and continuing emphasis on the theological virtues and on an understanding of and reception of the sacraments. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. McLuhan, for a stimulating lecture. You've been talking about the spellbinding power of the speaker, and I think we've had some experience of that this evening, so thank you very much. I've been asked to assist in moderating a question period. There is a microphone at the midpoint of the auditorium, and so I would invite members of the audience to come forward and ask their questions for Dr. McLuhan.
That was wonderful. You explained something that your dad talked about between the difference of what the medium is, and I now have a better understanding what he was talking about. You gave a lovely description of something I learned from psychiatry called paranoia, which is a warning beacon on the edge of awareness, and there's a tiger at the door, you'd better do something about it, or if the house is on fire, you should move. So, metanoia. So what I'm curious about in our day and age, and the precept to the question of what was going on here with the presidency in the United States, now the question is running through my little mind, and my mind is telling me that time is a construct that was formed a long time ago that has ripples or waves in it that the Mayans knew about, and they knew that the wave would break in 2012, so they had created something else, and that's starting to filter into us, which is what's happening now. With Mr. Trump and Twitter and Joan of Arc and her voices, are they both forms of bicameral consciousness?
Would you repeat the last, please?
That's my question. With Donald Trump and Twitter and Joan of Arc and her voices, are they both examples of bicameral consciousness?
Bicameral meaning both sides of the brain.
Forming a holographic process.
The rational left side and the mystical right side.
Yeah, jumping in the corpus callosum, creating, a beam me up Scotty situation.
We start with the hard one. It's interesting, isn't it, how Mr. Trump has intuitively taken to direct contact via Twitter. It doesn't go through a speechwriter or through a committee that vets his comments. You get it straight from, I hesitate, the horse's mouth. But the experience of Twitter is immediate, isn't it? I don't know how many of you tweet. I imagine it's most people here. I see in the restaurant in the morning, virtually every table somebody is staring at a little handheld, a tweeter. Tweeter used to be one of the speakers in a stereo display, or array. However, I'm getting a little off the subject. Using both? No, I don't think that we're using both sides of the brain at this point. I think it's all one side, the right-hand side, the electric side of the brain, the image side. Certainly, the people who respond first to new technologies, and they do it intuitively, without any kind of preconception or presupposition. There are two groups, artists and kids. They just latch on to whatever the new thing is, and they start playing with it and discovering what it can do. And they don't have any theories. And these media are all extensions of that right-hand side of the brain. They're not rational, and they don't engender rationality in the users. But they are intensely image-based and emotion-based. Intensely so. Which may explain some of Mr. Trump's approaches to his public and his success. The people who hate him most are the rational ones. They've got some detachment and they can stand back and say, no, look, I can see what's going on here. And that's the wrong way to approach. I've long maintained that representative government was a product of slow transportation. In the railway age, it would take quite a while, either by stagecoach or by railroad, to travel from one part of the country to Washington to let your views be known. So instead of that, you pick some guy from the local group and you send him or her off to Washington to do the job for you. A rep, a representative. Representational politics is unnecessary under electronic conditions. You can be there in a split second, wholly and completely. And Trump knows that. He is exploring and trying to figure out how to use that, how to do that. I have nothing to say about the moral plus or minus of the activities or man or his policies, but look at what is going on. My father always said that it's a wonderful advantage to live in Canada, in a backward country up here. We are always second or third in line in getting these new technologies and new service environments. But living up here, you look over the fence and you can see what your neighbors are up to more clearly than you can if you live there. In other words, we have a great advantage living here and not being in the center of the action. It gives us some detachment, some objectivity. Maybe not much, but some. I've tried to answer your question. It was a very big question.
You've got a very good point of the rational side of it, which I think is here. Because Trump ain't stupid, but he's still learning, which is the scary part. So I really thank you for your approach to other reaction to what he's doing. That's why I asked about George Bush, because she wasn't like that at all. She had something else going on. It ended up her getting destroyed. And I would hate to see that happen to any individual. So that's why I asked you that question.
Well, thank you. We have our own version of it up here in Mr. Trudeau,
Yeah, he's
who is all image.
yeah, no, he's smoking dope, and that's crazy. It's a different sense.
Another question.
Thank you, Dr. McLuhan. I have two little questions. So would you say of the four senses, the first two are more outer, the others are inner, that with the volume of digital media that most people experience, that the two inner senses are just overwhelmed by the volume and pressure of all the pictures and sounds that are coming at us?
The two inner senses are actually the chief ones now under electric conditions, because under these conditions most experience is interiorized immediately. And so you need those interior senses to sort them out.
Okay.
And the outer senses are the ones that, let's say, deal with experience over there, from which you have a bit of detachment, maybe not much, but a bit. I forgot to mention that there are two groups of those senses, intellectual senses. And I only spoke of the ones vis-a-vis the scriptures, the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the spiritual. But there is also the four senses of literature, of prose and poetry. And it was always the practice, in the Middle Ages at least, from the ancient world right up through, well, almost to the Renaissance, the Grand Renaissance, to train seminarians in working, flexing their muscles and learning how to use interpretive tools in poetry first. And once you had learned your chops in poetry, then you were ready to start working with the scriptures. And the four intellectual senses of poetry and prose are the literal sense, of course, what the letters present. Then there is the sense of the writer, or rather the speaker. Who says this? What is the mask that the writer is wearing to present these things to you? Third, there is, who's the audience? Who do you speak to this way? And what do you expect of that person? And then fourthly, if you speak to this guy this way about this matter, what effect does it have? Sense, feeling, tone, effect, impact. Those are the four senses of ordinary prose and poetry, and for that matter, advertising and news reports and everything else. But those four are also in parallel to the four senses of Scripture. So you learn the one, and there's a little sensus communis of each one. You learn the one as a precursor to practicing the other.
The other question was, in terms of mimesis,
Yes.
in ancient times, the monks or whoever was the religious who had access to the books or the scrolls, they would read the scriptures out loud, and that would be almost the Homeric example that somehow you're not reading this primarily as concepts, but you're speaking it, you're giving the tone, the sense, and that's the kind of knowledge that comes from that is different from the, or if you come to the scriptures with looking for this or that, you're coming with your concepts in front instead of just...
Instead of being open, you've got an agenda.
So almost like that's a form of mysticism because it's opening you to something that you don't already have ready to put onto the text. So I was just... Mimesis would be in that oral reading, Lectio Divina.
Yeah, mimesis was literally putting on and becoming the thing. And becoming the thing is a way of getting to know it from the inside. Not as something that happens over there, but from the inside. You put it on, you become it, and then you become infallible as an authority. I should mention, by the way, that silent reading came in with the telegraph. Before then, everybody read everything aloud all the time. And libraries were very noisy places. And that's where where and why they invented the carol. The carol was a set of walls on a table, and you would go in there and you could mumble or mutter your way through a text and not bother the guy next door. A little later, that was retrieved as the telephone booth. So when you see the telephone booth, which extends from your waist up to about here, and you make a phone call on one of these, this, keep in mind, comes from a long time ago, from the Middle Ages and the early 19th century library. So they had in libraries signs like "Only low conversation permitted." I have to think about that one. It's funny, isn't it, that reading aloud, or rather reading silently, which is interiorizing, started with the telegraph and picked up from there. Now, this had nothing to do with what the telegraph was used for or what the content of the messages were, any more than the effects of the motor car have anything to do with what the car is used for. It doesn't matter what you use the car for, you still get air pollution, you still have to have roads, gas stations. So the side effects, by the way, another name for the side effects is medium. When my father said the medium is the message, he meant that if you're going to have cars, then the message in the car is the roads and the gas stations and the politics that go with that, and air pollution and suburbs and so on, transformation of cities. That's the medium of the car. If you don't have roads, what the heck use is a car? If you can't get used, it's maybe a nice piece of sculpture, but it doesn't mean anything. The medium is that environment of services that surrounds any innovation. Look at the medium of the computer. That is, look at all the changes that the computer brought with it. It couldn't survive in the bureaucratic, top-to-bottom, hierarchical kinds of management and organization of society that we had before it arrived in the 60s and 70s and 80s. The computer hit the business office in the 80s, and it absolutely revolutionized it. Goodbye secretaries. Right? Now the boss does his own typing. It turned everything inside out and upside down. It flattened organization. And then it felt at home. The medium is the message of the computer and of everything else. Please.
Oh, thank you. First, I just want to tell you I appreciate your comments on the importance of liturgical form, and I wish that we could hear you speak about that for about an hour, but I know we can't. So I actually have a different kind of question. I have a sister-in-law who's an occupational therapist,
Ah,
and one thing that she's been finding is occupational therapists are now in high demand in schools, primarily in the early grades, in kindergarten and grade 1, for the reason that there's a new phenomenon that seems to be developing. She calls it, and they call it in occupational therapy, they call it sensory integration issues. And what they perceive to be the issue is that students who are growing up with a lot of screen contact are their sensus communis for their physical senses is not developing because their early interaction with images is in virtual reality. So when a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old learns, they learn by reaching out to touch a physical thing. And the sensus communis for the physical senses develops in that way, and of course this has been broken. So as a result, these kids have all kinds of issues in school. For one thing, they're very highly sensitive to physical stimuli. They are difficult then to communicate with. So it seems like the lack of a sensus communis on the physical level translates into the lack of a sensus communis on the other levels.
yep.
And some of the things that they do with these kids is very interesting. The first ways they try to correct some of this is they put them in harnesses and they turn them around in space and throw them upside down and they roll them around on the ground, and they actually move them around in space a lot, and it actually seems to have an effect on regenerating or preserving those other levels. So I was just wondering if you could just comment on what you see to be the connection between the restoration of the sensus communis on the physical side with the sensus communis of the other realms. Like, what comes first and what comes second, and is it different for children than it is for adults?
Well, I did say, I think that of the 3 different groups of senses, intellectual, physical, spiritual, they are all in touch with each other all the time. And so whatever happens to one, the others know about. There's been a lot of studies coming out in the last 10 years pointing out that these technologies are not necessarily very good for you physically and mentally. And they've now got a number of studies, for example, about the deleterious effects of cell phones and smartphones. There are studies also indicating that young children should not be exposed to these things. And doctors organizations beginning to urge that parents keep their kids away from them for at least 3 or 4 or 5 years. I'd say keep them away from them for 10 or 15 years because they are not habit forming, they're downright addictive. And they drive the individual user inwards. They don't develop as a consequence their bodily faculties, the outer ones. kids need to roughhouse, to roll around and run about and so on. Otherwise, they don't develop. Maria Montessori began studies. Actually, she did her doctoral dissertation on St. Thomas, which not many people know, and it's worth a look. But she was one of the first to try to integrate sensory work in the knowing process. And I think her time is high overdue. The big move right now is to dissolve the separation of school and life. To go back to reintegrating school and learning with everyday life. Some years ago, I and a school teacher, Kathy Hutchin, and my father wrote a book called City as Classroom. This was in the 70s, and things were a little different then. They're very much more so now. But the idea of City as Classroom was to get the kids out of the classroom and out into the environment to study the effects of technology and media on their lives. And then to go back into the classroom and report to each other. This was an early attempt at integrating learning and living and getting rid of that separation of faculties. There's no, in the electronic age, in kids' experience, there's no difference. The kids are no longer, they don't live in their own world and the adults live in a separate world. Any kid can get on a computer and access everything that the adults have. 40 years ago, people were lamenting the fact that, well, we have kids' shows and kids' programs on TV, but when mom and dad aren't around, the kids do channel hopping and they watch the same programs you do. There's no difference. If you look at the programs and the ads now, estimate the mental age of the shows that you watch and the ads that you watch and that you know by heart. And they're all geared at about the lowest possible mental age, about 5, 6 maybe. The vocabulary is carefully controlled, the sentence length is very carefully controlled to adjust to a very short attention span. And the shot duration, I was watching some trailers for movies last night as during the World Game, the last of the World Series. And I noticed that the average duration of a shot in the trailers was less than a second. 1 second ads are becoming frequent. 2 second ads, you'll see them. 3 and 4 second ads, lots of them. 40 years ago, the average length of an ad was 1 minute. That's about the length of the show between ads. Things have been reversing. They're playing to a very, very short attention span. That is, they're playing to the right hemisphere of the brain. It's only the left hemisphere that sustains attention in a linear fashion for extended periods. So it can conduct long, logical arguments. The ads don't work with logic anymore. They haven't for quite a while. The reason is, it doesn't work. Pay attention to some of these things like attention span. What's the attention span of your kids? Have a look. Anything further? One more. Or is that two?
I just have I'm actually not even sure how to frame this question, but you said the essence of electronics is transformation.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And as Catholics, we're also concerned with transformation. Could you speak a little bit to that? So if the essence of the electronics is to transform us in a spiritual sense or in an intellectual sense, to transform us closer to be like the electronics that we are using?
Yeah.
And then as Catholics, is that our transformation as Catholics, our spiritual transformation should be closer to being Christ-like? So can you just speak to that a little bit? And then practically speaking, we, as a lot of us educators, professors, teachers, or just in our general lives, how that is what practical things, measures can we take to transform ourselves one way versus the other?
Well, perhaps the essence of Catholicism is the sacramental system. We have 7 sacraments. Not 5 or 6, not 8, 9, or 10, 7. For some reason, 7 it is. Every single one of them transforms the recipient. Baptism marks the soul, puts a brand, a mark on the soul for eternity. Confirmation, the same. Some of the sacraments are available to people not in the church. Baptism is one of them. Only non-Catholics can be baptized. Right? You can't be baptized twice. I beg your pardon? I thought I heard a comment. And therefore, I would suggest to you that at least in this one dimension, and I'm just mentioning one facet of transformation, our entire approach to knowing God and our relation with God is based on transformation. The supreme transformation is, of course, the Eucharist, which leads directly to 2 other dimensions of experience, that of the mystical body and the resurrection of the body. I just want to digress here, having mentioned those 2 things, and urge you to get hold of a copy of John Paul II's magnificent work, The Theology of the Body. You'll find it on the internet. It's just called The Theology of the Body. And there's an organization that sends people around to give classes and lectures and courses in the theology of the body. It's a little bit heavy reading, but once you get used to the manner of presentation, the way they've organized it, it's organized like, do you remember way back in early days of movies when you go to the theater and each weekend you'd see half a dozen serials about 5 minutes of action of a Western or a cliffhanger of one kind, a minute or 2 of recap, here's where we left you last week, 3 or 4 minutes of new action, and then the cliffhanger. And they left to come. Well, that's a little bit the way the theology of the body is put together. A series of cliffhangers. They were audiences that the Pope gave over an extended period of several years. 1 a week, a new installment of this or that aspect of the overall approach to this matter of, he was interpreting Genesis, and just a few chapters in Genesis, and it wound up being this thick. And he let you know at the end that, well, we've just begun this one. In other words, it's very, very rich and very fruitful. But the importance of the body to our spiritual lives is impossible to overestimate. And right now we are having all kinds of assaults on the body. If you like, I'll give you a bit of a summary of some of them. I see a lot of hesitation and the very first line here is women's lib. Women's lib is based on bodies. The whole thing, the whole program. So just because my body is this shape and your body is that shape, there's no reason you can get away with discriminating unfairly. And this leads to other kinds of discrimination based on height, based on weight, based on shape or proportions, or age. There's even ageism, or on gender, sexism, or as on color, racism. The new sexual freedom has to do with a new attitude to the body itself. The legitimization of same-sex parentage of families. Don't discriminate based on the body. Legitimizing same-sex marriage. Legitimizing and social tolerance of prostitution. Legitimizing of lesbianism and homosexuality as just lifestyle choices. The destruction of childhood, and equally, the destruction of adulthood. It's very hard to find an adult now. Very hard to find an institution that will treat a certain group of people as adult. The disappearance of childhood was the topic of a book by Neil Postman, several of you know. But it was also dealt with by the artist Wyndham Lewis. The language of the body has become muted, and John Paul II made a very great point about the language of the body speaking to its complement. The body rendered as a programmable art form, not just in the literal sense of tattoos and piercings, but drugs, mind-altering, mind-changing drugs, psychopharmaceuticals, legalization of pot, for example, which is considered a recreational drug. But then things like cocaine and opioids, weight reduction programs, let's reshape the body, Viagra and so on, contraceptives, surgery. It's just the tip of the iceberg. I've got several pages of these. But the assaults on the body are coming at us from all quarters, and they interfere greatly with our sense of the sacramental character of the body. Remember, our Lord was crucified, which is a very particular body event or experience. And he rose from the dead bodily. And we all will, at the last judgment, rise from the dead with our bodies, whatever we've done with them. One of the latest things, and I invite you to watch this, and keep your eye on it, because it's very significant. It's a fairy tale, a total fairy tale, but a lot of people are taking it literally. It's called transhumanism. The idea that, and it's a correlative to the idea of the singularity, the moment when artificial intelligence reaches, equals, and then surpasses human intelligence. And they're now putting dates on it, 2050. You'll hear various dates thrown around. But transhumanism, the idea there is that of downloading the mind into a robot. The mechanical thing won't wear out. If it does, a little while, you just add a different arm, like rejuvenating the space station, and keep it going forever and ever and ever. It retrieves the idea of the fountain of youth, only technologized. But the idea there is, let's get rid of the body. Replace it with a machine, a robot, that can go on and on. You won't have a bad back any longer. You just throw a little oil at it and you're back to normal. If only it were that simple. You catch cold? Never as a robot. Look at the advantages. Look at the dehumanizing character. It is the soul that animates the body and that makes it human.
I will now invite my colleague, Dr. Tammy Marsh, to come forward and to give a final conclusion of thanks to Dr. McLuhan and to invite us to a reception following.
Good evening, everyone. I feel really tall up here. My name is Tammy March, and I'm SDM's Associate Dean. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to offer a few words of thanks on behalf of the college and the Dean's office. First, thanks to all of you for coming this evening. It's great to see so many people here. Thanks to all the people who are involved in the planning and organizing and helping out with the event, especially the choice of staff. Last night we had a delicious supper, and we're going to have a wonderful reception in a few minutes. Also like to thank Dr. Sarah Powrie for her wonderful introduction. And thanks again to Pat Keenan and the Keenan family for being here and for their support for the annual lecture in Michael's memory. Finally, I'd like to thank our guest speaker, Dr. McLuhan, for his stimulating and thought-provoking presentation this evening. I wrote down a number of things, but I'm only going to mention a couple of things that caught my attention. Media as an extension of man. Haven't really thought about that before. Direct experience by total submersion. You see that when my daughter's always on her phone or playing games. Faith comes by hearing. That one. And two modes of communication, inward and outward, and the negative effect that too much of the outward can have, the inward. And even interesting things like silent reading coming from the telegraph. So very interesting. And I'm going to ask you to come back up here for a second. We have a token of our appreciation for your time and your expertise with us this evening.